Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so this is somewhat of a follow-up to my presentation that I did last year. So I thought that maybe for those that missed the presentation last year, I should just briefly introduce our organization. So Conservation Outcomes is a non-profit company and a public benefit organization that was established to support land that is being developed and managed for biodiversity conservation, mainly outside of state-owned protected areas, although we do play in some state-owned protected areas or state-owned land as well. And a key focus of our organization is to secure important biodiversity, ecological integrity and resilience through the development of the conservation and wildlife sector. So our organization has a very specific focus, and we tend to try and stick to our focus. It's basically largely focused on protected area expansion and management. And so biodiversity stewardship forms a very big part of what we do. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with biodiversity stewardship and the approach, but for those that aren't, there's a quick slide to introduce that. So biodiversity stewardship is basically an approach to establish new conservation areas and protected areas on private and communally owned land by entering into voluntary agreements and partnerships with landowners. So it's working with landowners that want to conserve their land through voluntary agreements. And I'll share some of the various biodiversity stewardship options now, but basically what biodiversity stewardship requires is two things. Firstly, an area with high biodiversity value that warrants certain conservation status, and then secondly, landowner willingness to engage in the process and to conserve their land or manage their land in a certain manner. Yeah, it basically the management of the land remains with, in most instances, remains with the private landowner. And so the landowner becomes the custodian of the biodiversity on their own land. But we all know that landowners aren't always, ecologists and conservation managers. So there is the big need to really provide extension support and guidance to the landowner to make sure that they are managing their property in the correct manner and that they've got management plans in place and annual plans of operation and so on. And the NGOs, various non-profit organizations that's involved in biodiversity stewardship, often take on that role and the responsibility of providing that post-declaration support to make sure that it's not a paper park, but that it's a declared, nature reserve and that's actually managed for biodiversity conservation. So that's in essence what biodiversity stewardship is. Kan julle so een teruggaan? Dankie. Nog enetjie? Nog enetjie? Nog enetjie? Alright, so there's various biodiversity stewardship options available, as I've said. Our organization, to a large extent, focus on the formal protected areas. That's those three options. There's other options as well, but we mainly try and focus on these because those three options provide the most long-term conservation security for the land. And that's ultimately what we aim for. So just to create a bit of context, globally, protected areas are internationally recognized as a key strategy to conserve biodiversity and to maintain ecologically resilient and functional landscapes. And I'm sure a lot of you might know about the recent developments in terms of the global environmental or biodiversity, things that's happening globally. So the South African government is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And that means that the South African government has international obligations to implement the global biodiversity framework. Apologies. Julle na daai slide toe gaan met die pyltjie asseblief. Dankie. That's perfect. Yeah, so as part of the global biodiversity framework, there's various targets and so on that set for the governments that's a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but of specific interest to us is Target 3, that basically aims to have 30% of our lands, freshwaters and oceans conserved by 2030. Now that's obviously a very ambitious target, but I think what it translates to is that in the course of the next decade or so, there's going to be a lot of funding directed towards protected area expansion globally. And interestingly enough, Target 2 talks about restoration, which might also be of significance to the Thicket Forum specifically. So with that in mind, I think a question that I'd like to pose to the forum, and it's sort of a rhetorical question, perhaps everyone should think about it, not necessarily answer it here, but what does this mean for Thicket? So are we as a Thicket community ready and well positioned to make the most of this opportunity to get Thicket biodiversity adequately conserved? With this global drive, and probably a lot of funding that's going to become available within the next decade for restoration, but also securing new protected areas. And are we ready to really leverage that for the benefit of Thicket? So a large focus of my talk will be on trying to showcase some of the work that Conservation Outcomes is doing specifically in the Eastern Cape, and with the aim of creating a greater interest and understanding of the value of biodiversity stewardship amongst the Thicket community. So I'll show some of the projects that's focused in the Eastern Cape. Sadly, however, a lot of those projects does not include Thicket at this stage. But it doesn't really matter. The same principle or processes can easily be applied to the Thicket biome. So Conservation Outcomes is involved in the establishment of the new new Grassland National Park in the Eastern Cape on the Lesotho border. And it's an interesting model that they're following. It's not your typical model that as sort of to establish new national parks where land acquisition is the main component of it. So you buy land and declare it a national park. In this instance, a section of the park will be bought, or a section of the core section will be bought, but then there's various expansion projects to the park that incorporates private land into the national park. So it's not your typical model that we've been using to date to establish and expand national parks. Okay, so Conservation Outcomes is involved in a very specific manner. We've basically been contracted to provide technical support and expertise to SANParks and WWF, specifically around the legal requirements to declare the land as part of the national park. A lot of the private land that's been incorporated into the national park. To develop tools to assist in the declaration and the management of the national park, to do site assessments, that's biodiversity assessments, and to engage with the landowner negotiations regarding declaring and incorporating their land into the national park, developing a framework park management plan with the individual operational plans. It becomes quite complex since it's now a national park, but various other landowners, privately owned land that's incorporated into the park. So the management model becomes a bit complex, hence the need for individual operational plans as well. And then to provide assistance in the implementation of stakeholder engagements and to develop a sustainable rangeland model for the national park. Then we're also involved with a lot of private land, one of which includes the Rupert Nature Reserve that we're working it's a property that we're working towards declaring as a nature reserve near Graafreinet. A lot of you are familiar with the area, so I'm sure you know more or less where that is. I think this is quite a significant contribution from the landowners to conservation. As you can see, it's about more or less the same size of the Kamdebou National Park currently. Then one of our more long-term projects that we've got going in the Eastern Cape that's been running for about 8 years now is the Greater Kromme Stewardship project. And this is a project that's funded by a number of wind farms. They're all listed there. A number of wind farms in the Kaukama area of the Eastern Cape near Jeffreys Bay. So they're funding the project, and it's a voluntary thing. It's not a EIA obligation or a condition of the authorization or anything of that sort. It's a voluntary association that they've established and funding a conservation project. And the aim is really to leave a long-term conservation legacy in the landscape. And so some systematic conservation planning has been done. For the area, the red line is the broad project footprint, and then the shaded areas are the areas that through systematic conservation planning has been identified as the priority areas where most of our focus and efforts should go into to trying to establish a network of protected areas. And so the next few slides are all focused on the GKS project and what we're doing there. I'll just go through this real quick because I've got quite a few slides, so I am conscious of the time. But one of the first reserves that we declared as part of the GKS project was the Obos Grootrivier Nature Reserve, which is located next to the Garden Route National Park and acts as quite an important strategic buffer to the national park, especially with coastal access and parlemoen poaching and those sort of things. Then, where possible, as you can see from this map, we try, instead of creating small isolated reserves, trying to create a larger, well-connected network of reserves. It is a very difficult landscape to implement biodiversity stewardship because it's been subdivided so many times. So you're dealing with small properties and multiple landowners, and it can become quite complex and tricky, and it's not if you look at this landscape in terms of hectares that we're trying to declare, it may not seem that impressive, but if you look at it from the perspective of biodiversity value, it's just mind-blowing. There's multiple threatened species there, and I'll talk a bit about it a bit later. But as you can see, what we're trying to do, despite the difficulties of the landscape, the fragmented nature and the fact that the property sizes is so small and we're having to deal with multiple landowners, as far as possible we're working towards creating larger, well-connected reserves. And from a protected area expansion point of view, you got to take a long-term vision. 3 years ago, the areas didn't look that well connected that we were working on. But landowner perceptions takes quite a long time to change, and you need to build landowner relationships and so on. So, for example, this property here is the orange area belongs to 12 landowners, but most of them are companies, trusts, and CCs. And every company and trust and CC has multiple directors and members and trustees. So you end up with 30 or 35 decision makers just for that property. And so it really becomes difficult to move forward, and the process is slow. Other properties are easier and quicker where you've got a single landowner. Then it's much easier to progress with the process. But basically, we've established or starting to establish this network of reserves between Paradise Beach and the Krom River, and then also that little isolated reserve, but it had some Humansdorp Shell Renosterveld, which we couldn't resist not declaring. It's an endangered vegetation type. So I'll just briefly show you some photos just so that you get a sense of the sort of habitat that we're trying to conserve. And it's your typical coastal fynbos thicket mosaic vegetation types. And there's a lot of endemic plant species there. It's sort of your easternmost extent of the Cape floristic region with high levels of plant endemism and quite a few threatened species as well. And there's the Krommegeelhout Reserve on the top there, the plateau. You find the Humansdorp shell renosterveld. And then to just show you some photos of the second, can I say, node of protected areas that we're busy establishing. Some of them are already declared, some of them are in the advanced stages of the declaration process. I'll just show you some photos there that you can get a sense. That's that dune-felt vegetation type. It's also a coastal thicket, a fynbos thicket mosaic type of vegetation, but you find in those dune fields it's a very complex hydrological system as well. So you get a lot of wetlands and wetland seeps and dune pools, and it's a very dynamic system. Again, a large number of threatened and endemic species there. There's some more photos of the coastline areas. Within that Cape St. Francis dune landscape node that we're working on. And there's some more photos. And just so to sort of highlight the floristic importance of this area, a recent study that was done there, or fairly recent, showed that there was 402 plant species recorded within this Cape St. Francis dune landscape, 40% of which are endemic to the Cape floristic region, and there was 31 species of conservation concern. Quite a few of them critically endangered and endangered. So very, very important landscape from a conservation point of view. Then we're also playing on some state-owned land. This falls within that Cape St. Francis dune landscape node. The state-owned land presents its own challenges, having to engage with multiple state departments and so forth. I won't bore you with the details of that. Kan julle enetjie terugspring asseblief? Nog enetjie? Nog enetjie? There we go. All right, and then there's another node of state land areas that we're trying to expand. And the idea is there's a lot of dynamics in this particular landscape, but the idea is to, once we've secured the state land, there's then the opportunity to incorporate a lot of the private land and possibly create a larger reserve between Gamtoos and Kabeljauw's estuary. And who knows, one could possibly connect it with the state land across the Gamtoos and all the way to Van Stadens, that coastal strip basically. But that's dreaming big at this stage. For now, we're trying to deal with all the issues on those two areas of state land. That's just to give you a sense of what the biodiversity looks like there. It's a very diverse area. You'll see we find quite a few different vegetation types and habitat types there. There's Humansdorp shell renosterveld, which is an endangered vegetation type, and there's species there that's there's one particular species there, plant species, you don't find anywhere else other than the Humansdorp shell renosterveld between Jeffreys Bay and Gamtoos River. It's the only place where it occurs. It's a small population of about 500 plants. And so, yeah, but that's not the only threatened species. There's, I think, about 18 threatened species there, as well as then Sunday's mesic thicket. You get the more coastal fynbos thicket, mosaic veg types. And then your more your Cape seashore vegetation and all sorts of non-terrestrial, more aquatic habitats like wetlands and creeks and estuarine salt marshes and so forth. And yeah, then we also, that's the end of the Greater Kromme Stewardship project. We're also involved in quite a few smaller projects which mainly focus on offsets. We as an organization don't get involved in EIA work or anything. We're not a consultant. We're purely focused on protected area expansion. And but where there's a condition of an environmental authorization for a developer to secure an offset, then we'll typically be contracted to basically facilitate the declaration process. So as Alistair mentioned earlier, we're busy with the nature reserve, basically declaring additional property as part of the nature reserve. Then there's another offset project where we basically were contracted to declare this property as part of, well, not as part of this, but as a separate reserve, but as a nature reserve, as well as a tiny little nature reserve there. We are negotiating with the landowners to incorporate this as well. Then conservation outcomes. The conservation outcomes is also fixing a lot of the declaration issues that has happened in the past. The process to declare protected areas legally and technically quite complex. It's not as straightforward as it may seem. And so as a result, there's a lot of mistakes that were historically made with declarations, not just in the Eastern Cape, across the country, but we often the go-to guys to fix previous mistakes. So there's a project that was funded by the UNDP to look at 7 nature reserves, specifically the historic declarations, the issues that exist and what needs to be done to fix it. And it's a project that we're working on with other NGO partners as well. Almost done. So just an important point to make from this, as a result of the issues that were, the mistakes that were made with the declaration, it firstly puts the reserves in a position where their declaration can be legally challenged, for example, by a mining company or whatever. But then secondly, also, it creates very bad vibes with the landowners and a bad perception around biodiversity stewardship. And it's not biodiversity stewardship that's the issue, it was the implementation thereof. And so as a result, we're probably going to end up deproclaiming some of these reserves simply because we've lost the landowner trust. So that implementing biodiversity stewardship is really important, in the correct manner is really important. So the point being, biodiversity stewardship is an effective mechanism, and it's a well thought through, rigorous process. There's nothing wrong with the biodiversity stewardship as a mechanism and as a process, but the implementation thereof is often quite bad, and in the past was very sloppy. We have a much better understanding of what the process should be, a much better legal understanding of it. And so there's a lot of people also that plays in the biodiversity stewardship sphere, but there's few people that really dive deep into the technicalities and legalities around it. So if you implement biodiversity stewardship, make sure that you make use of someone that actually knows that has deep dived into the technicalities and the legalities around biodiversity stewardship. So yeah, some of the challenges in the Eastern Cape, well, not necessarily specifically in the Eastern Cape, a lot of these challenges are across the country, but it's technically and legally complex. As I've said, there's a fairly small community of practice that has deep dived into biodiversity stewardship, so it's often difficult to find enough warm bodies on the ground to implement biodiversity stewardship. The capacity constraints within government departments and the bureaucratic and inefficient processes are a big challenge across the board. Then there's competing land use, like prospecting and mining. Land claims poses a problem for declaring land. And then sometimes if there's not funding available, it can be, for certain landowners, be quite expensive to get their land declared. In other instances where there's funding available, it can be done at a much reduced or at pro bono cost for the landowner. Yeah, that's just a list of various partners we work with, and that's it. Done.